All right, are you ready to dive deep into some serious history? Today we're going way beyond just the textbook version of Abraham Lincoln.
Mhm.
Really going to try to understand him as a person.
And what's interesting here is the source we're using. It's bursting with emotion. It's a eulogy delivered just days after Lincoln's assassination.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking about that memorial discourse by Reverend Eddy, delivered in 1865. So not just a dry historical account, huh?
Right, exactly. Full of grief, anger, even calls for justice.
Oh, where?
It gives us a unique glimpse into how Lincoln was seen by those who lived through his presidency. Imagine, just days after Lincoln's death, the nation is in shock. Eddie's trying to make sense of it all, this monumental loss.
So what does this eulogy tell us about Lincoln, the man? I mean, does Eddy present him as a flawed human being or more like a legendary hero?
Well, he definitely leans toward the hero narrative. He paints Lincoln as, the ideal statesman, almost larger than life. He talks about his intelligence, his unwavering integrity, and even that famous sense of humor.
It's interesting how Eddy suggests Lincoln's humor wasn't just a personality quirk. Like it was essential for him to cope with the pressures of leadership.
Absolutely. Eddie even goes so far as to say that humor kept Lincoln from becoming overwhelmed or morbid. Imagine bearing the weight of a nation tearing itself apart.
I mean, yeah, it makes you wonder how anyone could find anything to laugh about.
Right.
Eddy really seems to put Lincoln on a pedestal, though, doesn't he? I mean, he uses some pretty strong language to describe him.
He does. For example, he says, and I quote, "Purity in the realm of moral decision and motive is a skylight to the soul through which truth comes direct." Abraham Lincoln was so pure in motive and purpose, looked so intensely after the right that he might pursue it, that he saw clearly where many walked and missed.
Wow. Pure in motive and purpose, saw clearly where many walked and missed. It's almost like Eddy's portraying Lincoln as a prophet.
It does have that feel, doesn't it? Really highlights the level of reverence people had for Lincoln, especially after his death.
Okay, so we've got this picture of Lincoln as this morally upright, insightful leader. But to understand his actions, we need to consider the context of his presidency. What was the state of the nation when Lincoln came into power?
Context is everything.
Right.
Remember, this is 1861. The country is on the brink of collapse. Tensions over slavery, which had been simmering for decades, have reached a boiling point.
Right. And the threat of secession, I mean, wasn't just some abstract idea, right? It was a very real and imminent danger. Several southern states had already declared their intention to leave the Union.
And to make matters worse, Lincoln's predecessor, James Buchanan, was seen as weak and indecisive. Many felt he had just allowed this crisis to spiral out of control.
So Lincoln inherits this incredibly volatile situation, a nation on the verge of civil war.
Precisely. And it's within this backdrop that Eddy outlines these four key principles, four pillars, if you will, that guided Lincoln's actions. To Eddy, these principles are what made Lincoln truly great.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's unpack these principles. What's the first one?
Eddy calls it the Union is incapable of division. Boils down to Lincoln's unwavering belief in a permanence of the United States.
So for Lincoln, the Union wasn't something that could be dissolved. It was the very foundation of the nation.
Exactly. And this unwavering belief explains why Lincoln refused to compromise on the issue of secession. He saw it as an attack on the very essence of America.
But this unwavering belief in the Union also led to some pretty controversial decisions, right? Like suspending habeas corpus during the war.
You're right. Habeas corpus is the legal principle that protects individuals from unlawful detention. Suspending it, even during a war, is a significant step.
So on the one hand, you have Lincoln fighting to preserve the Union. On the other, he's taking actions that some saw as infringing on individual liberties. It's a complex situation.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that suspending habeas corpus wasn't a decision Lincoln took lightly. He believed it was necessary to prevent further unrest and to protect the Union. What do you make of this? Was Lincoln justified in his actions?
It's a tough question. I'm sure people debated it fiercely back then, just as they would today. Well, let's move on to Eddy's second principle. What does he highlight there?
Eddy's second principle focuses on government by and for the people. It underscores Lincoln's deep faith in the American people and their judgment.
This seems like a stark contrast to some of the actions we just discussed, like suspending habeas corpus.
It might seem that way, but Eddy uses this principle to counter accusations of Lincoln being a dictator. He argues that Lincoln constantly deferred to the will of the people, even when they disagreed with him.
So despite the extraordinary measures he took during the war, Lincoln still believed in the power of democracy. He saw himself as a servant of the people, not a ruler.
Exactly. And Eddy really emphasizes this point, especially to address critics who called Lincoln a tyrant during his presidency.
Okay, this is fascinating. We're seeing different facets of Lincoln's leadership emerge. What's Eddy's third principle?
This one might surprise you. Eddy dives into the right to freedom. But he argues that Lincoln wasn't simply anti-slavery, he was pro-freedom. It's a subtle but crucial distinction.
I'm curious. What's the difference?
Well, abolitionists primarily focused on attacking the institution of slavery. Lincoln, on the other hand, emphasized the inherent right of all people to be free.
So it's a more positive, expansive view of human liberty, not just about ending slavery, but about ensuring freedom for everyone.
Exactly. And this is reflected in many of Lincoln's speeches and writings. Do you remember his famous quote where he compares those who would repress liberty to people trying to muzzle the cannon that celebrates Independence Day?
Oh, yes. It's such a powerful image. You can almost hear the cannon fire and feel the spirit of celebration. It really underscores how deeply Lincoln believed in freedom as something to be cherished, not suppressed.
Absolutely. But there's another layer to this principle. Eddy also points out that Lincoln differentiated between political equality and social equality. He acknowledged that granting legal rights, like the right to vote, didn't automatically translate to complete social integration. It's a distinction that we're still grappling with today.
That's a really important point. It adds nuance to our understanding of Lincoln's views on race and equality. So we've got Lincoln the Unionist, Lincoln the Democrat, Lincoln the champion of freedom. What's Eddy's fourth and final principle?
This one might surprise you. Eddy emphasizes Lincoln's profound religious dependence.
Really? That's not something we often hear about.
I know, it's fascinating, right? Eddy repeatedly mentions Lincoln's reliance on God and prayer, even though Lincoln wasn't a member of any specific church.
It makes you wonder how much his faith influenced his decision-making during such a tumultuous time.
It definitely adds another dimension to our understanding of Lincoln. We'll dig into this a bit deeper in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've got these four pillars. Unwavering support for the Union, trust in the people, the right to freedom for all, and a deep reliance on God.
And according to Eddy, these are the very principles that allowed Lincoln to navigate one of the most turbulent periods in American history.
But of course, as we know, the story doesn't end there. Lincoln's stance on slavery ultimately led to his assassination, and Eddy's reaction to that is, well, let's just say it's intense.
It is. We'll delve into the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination and Eddy's powerful and perhaps unsettling response in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
Welcome back, everyone. We're exploring Abraham Lincoln through this fascinating lens. It's a eulogy delivered just days after his assassination.
It's incredible, isn't it? The raw emotion, the context of 1865 America, it just, it really adds layers to history we don't always get.
Yeah. We left off talking about those four pillars of Lincoln's leadership, as seen by Reverend Eddy. His unwavering belief in the Union, his trust in the people's judgment, the pursuit of freedom for all, and that surprising emphasis on his religious side.
Right, and now we kind of have to, tackle the elephant in the room, which is Lincoln and slavery.
Yeah, and Eddy doesn't shy away from this at all. He digs into how Lincoln really wrestled with this issue, especially considering those border states.
Yeah.
The ones that were hesitant to let go of slavery even as the war raged on.
Yeah, imagine you're Lincoln in that situation, right? The nation is splitting apart, and you're trying to balance these competing interests while staying true to this, moral compass.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
And Eddy emphasizes that Lincoln really saw slavery as this existential threat to America, like not just morally wrong, but something that was tearing the country apart at its very core.
And we see that reflected in Lincoln's own words. There's this powerful quote from his 1864 letter to A.G. Hodges where he kind of lays bare his stance on slavery. He writes, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel, but I understand that my oath as president even forbade me to practically indulge my primary abstract judgment on the moral question of slavery."
So he's basically saying, look, I personally believe slavery is wrong, but as president, I have to consider the law, the stability of the nation.
Exactly. And then it gets even more intense, right? Because he continues. Lincoln says, "I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation. Right or wrong, I assumed this ground and now avow it.
Right or wrong, it's such a loaded phrase, you could almost feel the weight of everything, all the decisions.
It's huge, and he's acknowledging that he might be overstepping his authority, but he believes he's doing it to save the nation. And then he uses this analogy.
Oh, I remember this. He compares slavery to a diseased limb. Like it has to be amputated to save the life of the patient.
Exactly. By general law, life and limb must be protected. Yet often a limb must be amputated to save a life, but a life is never wisely given to save a limb. I felt that measures, otherwise unconstitutional, might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation.
Wow. Powerful stuff.
Yeah.
He's essentially arguing that preserving the Union, even if it means taking these extreme measures, is the only way to ensure the nation's survival.
And this leads us to the Emancipation Proclamation. For Eddy, this wasn't just a political document, it was a moment of moral reckoning, almost a spiritual vindication.
He uses that word, vindication. It's like God himself was endorsing emancipation.
Yes.
And then he points to, the string of Union victories that seems to follow the proclamation as like further proof of this divine approval.
So for Eddy, ending slavery was both a moral necessity and the fulfillment of God's plan for America.
It's a powerful combination, this political pragmatism and religious conviction.
It really is.
It makes you wonder how much this kind of thinking resonated with people back then. Was this like a widely held view?
It's hard to say for sure, but Eddy's eulogy definitely gives us a glimpse into the mindset of at least a segment of the population. Remember, this was a time of intense religious fervor, and the Civil War was often framed as a battle between good and evil.
Right, right. And then just as the war is winding down and the nation is on the cusp of healing, Lincoln is assassinated.
And Eddy's reaction is raw, unfiltered grief and rage. He calls Booth a pirate who shot the pilot just as the ship was reaching safe harbor. There's just this visceral anger in his words, a deep sense of betrayal.
It's chilling. His words about hunting down the assassin, no matter where he hides, are striking. You can feel the intensity of everything, all the emotions swirling around this event.
I remember this eulogy was delivered mere days after the assassination, so emotions were running high, people were terrified, they wanted answers.
Yeah.
And Eddy even compares Booth to Richard III, the Shakespearean villain haunted by the ghosts of his crimes. It's almost as if he's trying to curse Booth from beyond the grave.
Wow.
And his call for justice doesn't end there. He demands harsh punishment for Confederate leaders, execution, banishment, stripping away of all rights.
It really highlights those anxieties, those desires for retribution that were so prevalent in the aftermath of the war. There was this need to hold someone accountable, to punish those deemed responsible for, the bloodshed for Lincoln's death.
Absolutely, and it's a stark reminder of the wounds left by the war and how deeply personal this conflict was for so many. But then Eddy makes this fascinating comparison between Booth and John Brown.
John Brown, the abolitionist who was hanged for his raid on Harper's Ferry.
The very same. Eddy points out the irony of Virginia executing Brown for his actions and then a Virginian Booth turning around and committing this heinous act.
It's a sharp observation. He's essentially saying, look at what you've wrought, Virginia. This is the consequence of your intolerance.
Exactly. But amidst the anger and the grief, Eddy also tries to offer this glimmer of hope. He calls for prayers for Lincoln's widow and children, reminding listeners that this isn't just a political tragedy, it's a deeply personal one for those closest to Lincoln. And he urges people to pray for Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor. And he acknowledges Johnson's flaws, but expresses faith in his ability to, lead the nation through this difficult transition.
So he's appealing for unity.
He is. He's calling for unity, urging people to trust Johnson and to work together to rebuild the nation. It's a really powerful mix of emotions: despair, anger, hope, and just this deep faith in the future of the nation.
So we've covered a lot of ground. Lincoln's character, those leadership principles, his views on slavery, and then the immediate reactions to his assassination.
But there's still more to unpack. In our final segment, we'll reflect on what Eddy's discourse reveals about Lincoln's legacy and how it continues to shape our understanding of this really pivotal figure in American history.
Stay with us. You won't want to miss it. We're back, and, we've been on this journey through Lincoln's life and legacy, seen through this really unique lens of that eulogy, right? Delivered just days after his assassination.
Yeah, it's amazing how much this one speech, Eddy's memorial discourse, gives us insight not just into Lincoln, but the emotions and anxieties of 1865 America.
We've explored Lincoln's character, those 4 guiding principles Eddy outlined, the complexities of his stance on slavery, and then that raw reaction to his death.
Right. And now the big question. What does all of this tell us about Lincoln's legacy? How did he go from a man to a symbol, a figure etched in American consciousness?
Well, Eddy makes some pretty bold comparisons. He puts Lincoln right up there with George Washington, suggests that Lincoln's name might actually shine even brighter in the future.
Almost prophetic, isn't it? And it reflects just how profoundly Lincoln's death impacted the nation. He wasn't just a president, he became a martyr for the cause of union and freedom.
So Eddy's eulogy, in a way, is less about objective history and more about shaping this specific image of Lincoln in the public imagination.
Exactly. He's crafting a narrative, emphasizing the values Lincoln embodied, the challenges he overcame, and that ultimate sacrifice he made for the nation.
And this narrative has endured to this day. Think about it. The Lincoln Memorial, the statues, the portraits, the way he's quoted and invoked in political speeches, it all builds upon that foundation laid by people like Eddy.
It's fascinating how these early interpretations can have such a lasting impact. But does that mean Eddy's view is the only way to understand Lincoln?
Of course not. History's never that simple. No single perspective can really capture the full complexity of a figure like Lincoln.
But that's what makes Eddy's perspective so valuable. It captures the emotion, the hopes and fears of that specific moment, the immediate impact of Lincoln's loss before the dust settled, before history really had a chance to weigh in.
It's like this unfiltered glimpse, right? We're seeing how Lincoln was perceived by those who lived through his presidency, who witnessed the turmoil and the triumph firsthand.
Exactly. And it reminds us that history isn't just dates and facts. It's about human lives and emotions and the stories we tell ourselves about the past.
So why should someone listening today care about this one man's perspective on a president who died almost 160 years ago?
It makes you think, right? How do we construct our understanding of these figures? Whose voices get privileged and whose get silenced? And how do these narratives, shape our present and our future?
It's about engaging with history, recognizing that it's not fixed or objective, it's constantly being reinterpreted and reshaped.
And here's a thought to ponder. Eddy portrays Lincoln as this divinely chosen leader, almost saintly. Do you agree? And how does that view, or a different one, influence how we assess Lincoln's actions and his legacy?
It's a great question to wrestle with. This deep dive hopefully has given you not just information about Lincoln, but a new way to think about how we make sense of the past, how the past shapes our understanding of the world today.
Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. Until next time.